very much, everybody. Yes, I guess I am quite interested in this historical period, so hopefully we'll have an entertaining and interesting evening. I'm going to sit down because I appreciate I need to be, with the Zoom, I ought to be speaking quite near to the microphones. If you don't mind, I will sit down. Also, as you can see, I'm a bit too large and I'm in front of the screen, so hopefully you will all be able to see the images I've got in front of me. I was originally going to call this talk Cobblers, Combs and Chicory. But I thought that might be a bit much. I will, however, be talking about all three, as well as rather more conventional industries as we go forward. But obviously, we start with that beautiful painting of All Saints and all the rest in that particular picture there. On we go. Just to sort of summarize what we're talking about, early Victorian York, 1840s, York on the cusp of a big industrial change. By then, the service sector was still dominating York's employment. And in many respects, the Industrial Revolution has already passed York by, at least initially. So there's some respects, York is still largely a pre-industrial town, a market town relying on the gentry, commercial mercantile work. The large proportion of the population that was working were in, of course, inevitably domestic service, that rather hidden trade or industry, but which actually was probably the biggest sector of employment really in the city. Clothing trades inevitably important too, and shopkeepers, many sold food and other locally produced necessities. And at this stage, only a small proportion of the male population was working in what one would more likely call modern manufacturing. On we go. Of course, picking up the thread of the retailing and shops, of course, Joseph Rowntree, born in Piccadilly, was involved with the shop that opened on the site in 1822. The building, of course, is misleading. This is a later building, but the shop that opened in 1822, and that's obviously the plaque on the wall of the Pizza Hut, explaining Rowntree as a Quaker businessman and all the other features that we are fully aware of. I'm not going to say much more about Rowntree's at this stage, but I will be talking about Terry's a wee bit later. Just to set the context, it's worth going back a little bit earlier to the 1800s, the 1700s or the 18th century. York was a major social centre in the north. You've got racing, assizes, the New Walk, the Theatre Royal, Assembly Rooms, many other buildings, and of course the Mansion House as well, all had a major impact on York as a social centre. And that was facilitated by other things, the newspapers, books and maps, the better travel with the turnpike roads. And it all is wrapped up in this curious concept of politeness, civility, sociability, improvement, which a lot of academics have been using to describe many elements of the 18th century, especially in New York. And some of our best examples there, so you've got the Assembly Rooms, the Theatre Royal, the oldest part of the Theatre Royal, and New Walk, of course, with its promenade of people in wonderful clothes, you know, passing through that wonderful section of York. By the end of that period, so around the 1800s, we're looking at all sorts of economic, social, and political change. In particular, in other parts of the north of England, you've got industrialization and urban growth. It was happening in York, but slower perhaps than in other areas. There are also question marks about the quality of the urban environment. The elite who used to live in York would be moving to the countryside or the seaside, or of course, in other cases, going into the suburbs. And the road travel improvements made London more accessible from the north. I'm still talking here about pre-railway days, though. Leeds and other northern cities were becoming more wealthy, with their own industry starting to grow significantly. In practical terms, what does that mean for York? You've got a context where the walls, etc., and other properties are in poor repair. Houses becoming empty as their occupants move away to the suburbs. I would say Leeds and even London as a competitor for social life. And there's a feeling certainly that the likes of the Theatre Royal, the Assembly Rooms, and horse racing in York was losing much of its lustre compared to how significant it was once upon a time. There were some more positive responses. The growth of the festival concert rooms just behind the Assembly Rooms today. Little chance of seeing them now, but they were significant in around the 1820s, certainly. Yorkshire Museum, of course, 1830 opens, and the creation of St Leonard's Place, housing professional people working in the city. St Leonard's Place still looks magnificent today, and obviously an important part of a series of building developments that took place in the early to middle 19th century. I think the other context is a sort of change in the social fabric of York, a more professional and entrepreneurial spirit rather than relying solely on the country gentry. Learned societies, of course, become active. There's our predecessor, and there's the of YAYAS, which with the shield on the right. You've also got the likes of the Footpaths Association, the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, with the British Association meeting here in 1831, the York Medical Society as well, and just a general more vibrant intellectual life, which has important benefits to York as we go through the 19th century. A couple of buildings here, the Mechanics Institute, now the Masonic Hall, which is on St Saviour Gate, and of course the Yorkshire Philosophical Society and the Yorkshire Museum, as I say, that opens in 1830. So we've got York in the 1840s, still really a market centre for the surrounding countryside, and that's a lovely painting of York. That's meant to be, I'm sure that is Monk Bridge, and with a horse and cart travelling over it. The beginning, interestingly, of some suburban development you can see outside the city walls around in Monkgate itself, those sort of areas, with the minster in the background. It's one of my favourite paintings of York. So where were people working? In the 1840s. It's a fascinating period. York on the cusp of industrial change, but maybe not quite there just yet. A market centre for produce for the surrounding countryside. I've touched on that before. A place where goods and services were sold. Small-scale handicrafts and trades, which is what we'll be talking about some of those later. Services aimed at the individual. The most obvious is domestic servants, but also other groups of employees providing that service as well. And some distinctive industries, with the start of bigger things coming for the railways and the confectionery industries, as we'll see towards the end of the talk. Just a quick comment on population. York's population between 1800 and 1841 rose by 71%. Significant growth. That growth would continue and, if anything, accelerate into the rest of the 19th century. Most of that population increase was in migration into York from other parts of the country, particularly other parts of the north. The 1831 census, this is some of the selected occupations. Top of the list, in fact, double the size of any other, if you like, economic sector, other domestic servants. Absolutely enormous contribution clearly was a substantially significant part of the York economy. The property owners and people who had their own domestic servants, and the numbers continued to grow during the 19th century, though proportionately not quite so significant as they were in those days. Then there was a series of handicraft trades associated with horse transport and with ties to the countryside. It's things like the coach drivers, and coach owners, the horse dealers, the coach keepers as well. Also, that extraordinary group of the boot and shoemakers. One report suggests that there were some 440 people making boots and shoes in York around the 1831 census period. That's an extraordinary number, if that is correct. The photograph is of kids' boot makers, which is actually one of the shops inside the Castle Museum. So I guess that was probably materials from the real shop that was moved into there later. Retail distribution, very, very significant, of course, 500 people in that area, and 340 working in the building trades, with the usual other suspects, the hotels, inns, and the beer sellers and brewers, but only a few in manufacturing, and generally in fairly small scale manufacturing, chemists, jewelers, and so on as listed. By 1851, the pattern had changed slightly. Manufacturing was becoming more significant, and we'll drill deeper into have a look at manufacturing in a few minutes' time. But the domestic service numbers have grown, but proportionately probably less significant as they were. Those shoemakers and people making other clothes, making and dealing in clothes and shoes, still huge part of the economy. Distribution, construction, transport, the rest is listed per there, and I will talk about a number of those in a few minutes' time. And also remember other sectors certainly growing. Insurance, professional services. The best example there is obviously the Yorkshire Insurance, as per Harker's in St Helens Square today. Very, very important. And the retail sector, that's a photograph from Stonegate, but clearly shops, permanent shops, as opposed to market trading, becoming more and more significant as well. So let's have a look at some of these people in detail, some of the manufacturers particularly that were starting to grow at this time. We'll start with chemists. There was a manufacturing chemist business in Colliergate established by John Dales in 1780, who was twice Lord Mayor of York. The business, James Moore Butterfield succeeded into the business and was joined by Joseph Clark. They traded as Butterfield and Clark at 23 Colliergate in York, wholesale druggists and manufacturing chemists. Butterfield died in 1856, but William Bleasdale brought an interest in the firm, and they made and sold a wide range of pharmaceutical preparations and was a sole proprietor when he died in 1880. But this became quite a significant industry at one stage in York, in the manufacturing sector. Glass. There'd been a long history of glass manufacture in York, going back really to the 1600s. But the first glassworks at Fishergate first opened in 1794 by John Hampson and John Prince, later conducted by Messrs. Prince and Prest, the same company, to make flint glass and medicinal bottles. It was built on what had been St. Andrew's Priory. The River Foss was important as a part of the location to bring coal and raw materials for them. And the York Flint Glass Company was set up in 1835. Later, in the following century, it was incorporated in the National Glass Works, which later became Redfern National Glass in 1967. Many of us will remember the closure of Redferns, I think, at the end of 1983. But there'd been glassworks on Fishergate for nearly 200 years. John Walker Iron Foundry. Walker in 1815 became an apprentice iron founder to Thomas and Joseph Gibson at a foundry in what is now Dixon's Yard in Warmgate, adjacent to the River Foss. Again, the river's important always for all these manufacturing businesses. He married Jane Tomlinson in 1827 of Wenby. The foundry site on the banks of the River Foss was actually on land that had originally been the King's Fish Pool, which had obviously silted up a long time before, so that it was reclaimed land. And the area was unfortunately not in good condition in terms of housing. 5 of the Walker's 7 children died because of the unhealthy conditions, only 1 surviving beyond the age of 23. He became a partner. Walker became a partner in the business in 1829, and by 1837, after Gibson's retirement, the Walker's Iron Foundry was formally founded. Iron and brass founder, bell hanger and smith, again at Dixon's Yard. His commissions were mainly local originally, Museum Gardens, York Minster, of course, but also he was appointed iron founder to Queen Victoria in 1847 and achieved his most important commission, the gates and railings of the British Museum. He also made the gates for Kew Gardens in London. By 1851, he employed 52 men, and there's some evidence he may have reached about 100 workers later in the century. Very, very important business. I thank Catherine Sutherland for a couple of those photographs of the detail from some of the iron foundry work in York. It's so impressive and fantastic. And of course, also including some of the gas lamps outside York Minster as well. By the mid-19th century, the area was surrounded by tightly packed buildings. So you've got Dixon's Yard Foundry right on the river. And then it was sold in 1856 for £1,000, and the Walker's firm's work continued at the Victoria Foundry very nearby, basically where the Yorkshire Evening Press office later was. If you remember when they had their office in Warmgate. John Walker died in 1853, was succeeded by his son William, who later took up his mother's maiden name, so it became William Tomlinson Walker, and you see that on billboards and advertising in several different places. So the company changed its name to Tomlinson Walker Limited. And William's son, John Richard Walker, assisted him in the business when William died in 1911. Walker sadly ceased trading shortly after John's death in 1923, but had nevertheless been a significant and very successful company, and was obviously one of the good examples of a local company making good and gradually increasing its numbers of employees significantly. Another industry in terms of manufacturing was boat building. And a bit like the glass manufacture, boat building has a long tradition in York, going back centuries, certainly back to medieval times. But what I'm going to particularly talk about is boat building around the Skeldergate and Clementhorpe areas. There was shipbuilding outside Skeldergate postern in the 17th century, and many of York's boat builders, as I say, Clementhorpe or Skeldergate, definitely that side of the River Ouse. York yards focused on really smaller vessels, sloops and keels, and ship repair and overhaul. Not necessarily huge vehicles, of course, as they had to get through Neyburn Lock. Nevertheless, the boats would be between 40 and 120 tons. Clementhorpe Slipway was built in 1836 And if you look at, visit Clementhorpe, you'll see certain amount of evidence of the shipbuilding along the riverfront, and obviously in the Slip Inn, the pub that is very prominent in the Clementhorpe area. Winches, chains, and a hauling bridge over the slipway as well. So they would have had all the accoutrements necessary for shipbuilding and for ship repairs as well. The slipway lasted about 100 years. The industry was very successful, and ship launches, of course, drew crowds, and there were plenty of those. Unfortunately, not all the shipyards were successful. They weren't. They'd got into financial difficulties from different times, and a number of pleasure boats ended up being built as well. The boats could be moored at wharves right alongside the industrial premises. So that's obviously was a significant business at one stage, and it's great that it's still echoed in the name of the Slip Inn and in other elements that you see around the Clementhorpe area. And I need to mention confectionery, and we're looking at Terry's. Joseph Terry, born in Pocklington, came to York to serve as an apprentice apothecary in Stonegate before setting up shop as a chemist in Wormgate. He married Harriet Atkinson in 1823, who was a relative of Robert Berry, who already had a small confectionery business. This was Baildon and Berry, which was founded, of course, in 1767, and hence was, of course, that was the date that was often referred to with some of Terry's products. That was originally based near Bootham Bar. Joseph gave up his Wormgate chemist's operation and joined Berry's business, which by now was in St Helens Square at the end of the 1820s. Brewer's Court, as you can see from my rather artful photograph, is quite near the Mansion House. It's basically between what I still call the Yorkshire Insurance property, which is obviously Harker's, and heaven knows what it's called now, but it was, of course, the Terry's Cafe and Restaurant. Brewer's Court, it's often sort of seems to be locked off, but it's well worth the risk of a trespass to wander down there and see what's what. Very occasionally, people tell me that the gate at the bottom is open and you can actually see one of the older buildings, which I think is still a listed building, but it's basically out of sight, which is a great shame, but inevitable. That building became known as Joseph Terry House. As I say, Brewery's Court is there. The company were making all sorts of different types of sweets and confectionery. So it would be cakes, sugared sweets, candied peel, marmalade, medicated lozenges as well. Not so much on the chocolate front, you'll notice. He made use of the railways to get his products around the north of England and eventually into the Midlands and to London. Joseph Terry died in 1850, but his name was becoming well known, and his son, Joseph Jr., really was the guy who built on the foundations and expanded this into a major concern. The property transferred to a riverside site at Clementhorpe in 1864, and of course that was the ideal location, connection to the Humber estuary, all the coal and other things needed, and all the other ingredients, and also the products going out as well. A note here was that in 1867, the company was making some 400 separate items, but only 13 were chocolate. The specialized chocolate section was eventually built and created. As many of you know, the St Helens Square property was retained as a shop and restaurant. And you can still see the name Terry's. That particular sign is still at the base of the plinth on which the big shop window can be seen. Bit more on some of the handicrafts and clothes and other small-scale manufacturing that was significant around this time. And I've listed a few on here. One I've not talked about, but is worth a mention, is the Thomas Cook 1837 Stonegate workshop. because, of course, eventually we will have the observatory in the museum gardens going back to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society and the Yorkshire Museum. And the observatory, of course, has still a significant Thomas Cook telescope in there. Very so an important, very important business within York. But I particularly want at this point to talk about combs. What did I say? I'm supposed to talk about cobblers, combs, and tickery, because that was what I promised to do in the flyer before. Well, I've talked about shoemaking and bootmaking. Let's turn to talk about combs. Well, combs, again, like other industries, is a very traditional business. Comb makers worked in ivory and tortoiseshell as well as horn. A bit like they used to say that shoe shops tend to gather together so that they're all selling to the same customers. It seems that comb makers did the same, mainly focused in the Micklegate area in York, North Street, Fetter Lane, Blossom Street, Tanner Road. I'm just going to talk about two examples. But as I say, there were several companies that made combs. One was the Stewart family. Their works was on Blossom Street and was operated at first by George Stewart and then by his sons John, then Edward and Henry. George Stewart was apprenticed to a Charles Forbes in 1807, but he's listed in the 1818 Trades Directory as a comb maker and listed as being at Micklegate Bar Without, which I think relates to Blossom Street. That was the address of the company, anyway, later on. The reason for the photograph is that there's a memorial to the Stewart family in St Mary's, Bishop Hill Junior, and the plaque refers to several of those family members. It was obviously originally for George, but there's also references to John and then Edward Stewart on the tablet inside the memorial inside the church. Another significant comb company was Rougier, Joseph Rougier, bringing horns and combs from 1823 to 1930. The company lasted 100 years. Rougier had a works near Tanner Road, gave his name to the street nearby, obviously Rougier Street. The factory, 4 to 30 Tanner Road, until 1927, when it was demolished, in terms of the modern world. By 1861, he was employing 16 men, 5 women, and his son and grandson, they took over the business, a bit like the Stewart family through the business, through the family. The contents of the factory were and they've made a reconstructed comb maker's workshop as well. I should have tried to get a photograph of that. I will do next time I'm in the Castle Museum. Farming and agricultural produce. Yes, of course, York was a market centre for such. So much economic life, the fairs and the markets that go back centuries. And remember, this time, we're still talking about much of York inside and outside the walls, rural in nature. So not surprising about the importance of the market. It's plural and very, very significant in terms of how York operates. But I promised chicory, so we better get on with it. Appears in all sorts of textbooks as a sort of here today trade that suddenly took off like wildfire, employed hundreds, and then just disappeared, almost apparently. It turns out it wasn't quite that way. The crop was grown in Dunnington, in the Dunnington area. The village and the surrounding area, chicory production, with labourers coming from Warmgate to harvest. So as I say, Dunnington was the focus. It was probably introduced around And there were 3 chicory merchants in the parish of Dunnington in 18. For much of the, so as I say, much of the homegrown chicory was cultivated in or near Dunnington. The English chicory metropolis. How about that? That's quite a thing, isn't it? I've chosen the photograph of the Cross Keys pub in the centre of Dunnington because apparently kilns that was used was it more or less in the car park pub. I don't think any of the kilns still exist. The last one may have been demolished around the 70s and 80s. If there's nothing existing there, but as I say, it was clearly a significant trade. At one stage, the industry was said some 400 people for much of the year, with hundreds of itinerants employed during high harvest. It is quite extraordinary. There were 9 disused kilns in the parish, in which the roots had been washed, sliced, roasted, ground down, and dried. One use of it, according to a book called The Feeding of York by Eileen White, was ground chicory mixed with acorns and breadcrumbs was regarded as an instant tonic and cure for insomnia. So there. So now you know what to do. So that's chicory. The industry seems to have been really wobbly and peaks and troughs all over the show. In 1872, a great quantity of chicory was grown, but by 1902, none of the 12 surviving kilns were still in use. But a small amount apparently still continued to be grown until the 1930s. It's most mysterious, but it's interesting that those itinerant workers, the Irish workers living in Warmgate, working in Dunnington, as I say, for about 15 years, it was very, very significant. And that's great. Another industrial sector, obviously, is transport and communications. I'm going to talk about railways, but we need to also mention, of course, the substantial numbers of people working in other areas of the communication sector, especially the stagecoaches, the saddlers, the people who were working in the stables and so on. It's worth here giving a plug to the latest edition of York Historian, which features a section on Mint Yard. Of course, by this stage, Mint Yard was certainly not the library. It was a collection of stables and other businesses, particularly associated, well, coming on later, I guess, with some of the other hotels that were being built across the road, such as Ettridge's on Museum Street. All the horses bringing these people in the mail coaches, they needed stabling. And Mint Yard was a substantial stabling area, and no doubt there were a lot of people employed either directly or indirectly as a result of all of that. But particularly, it's worth highlighting here the growth of the railway industry from very small numbers. In 1841, the census employment implies 41 people working in the railway industry. The photograph, of course, is one of York's most famous old photographs or old buildings associated with the railways. That's the water tank, which I'm going to look at John. I take it is still there. But it's probably a bit shaky. Yes, oh, I'm aware of that. But they've not pulled it down. They can't pull it down. Yay, good. There you go. So that was worth putting that picture in. By 1851, 513 people working in the railway industry. But of course, this was the period where everything takes off. We've got obviously, first of all, in 1839, with the water tank, there was a sort of small railway halt, I guess, outside the city walls. Then you have, of course, West offices, as we now know it, but the original railway station, the big railway station in 1841. I also point out that I will show a couple of pictures of the railway station in a minute. That don't forget, of course, although the mail coaches to London ceased in 1842, horsepower was still fundamentally important to the way York run in terms of getting people and goods from the railway station or the railway goods yards around and across the city. So there was still plenty of employment for the saddlers and for anybody working in the railway sector. In the mail coach and horse sector, I suppose you'd call it. Horsepower still fundamentally important. And obviously we're talking about the start of bigger things from the 1840s onwards in terms of the railways. And it's whatever might think about West offices, it's great that the building is still there. The front entrance into this, what was clearly a tremendous station. And also, the other pictures. I guess we will be interesting to see in a few, well, it depends how long the project takes. With the demolition of Queen Street Bridge, we'll actually be able to see a bit more into where the railway station used to be. On we go. A sort of wrap up of all sorts of other issues as well to do with construction, office, and other employment. Population was growing, so construction needs, of course, remain. There were huge infrastructure needs around the 1840s, 1850s. We're talking, of course, about the railways and the original building of them in the 1830s. I've got a copy of one of those Stranger's Guides to York. This one was printed in 1838. And several sections in there make future reference to the railway station and the works that were going on in York at that time. I'm reminded crazily of the disastrous situation with HS2. That obviously it's a good job nowadays, in the past, that they had more ambition to get on with things. Because I'm thinking of all the publicity that there's been for the new future railway with HS2. And now, of course, the whole thing is falling apart. And it remains to be seen if they even finish the section to Birmingham. But surely they will. But certainly in York, they did manage to get on with it and get this station built. But there's all sorts of other things as well. Urban development, Parliament Street in the 1830s. St Leonard's Place, similar period. Duncan Place, Foss Islands Road, indeed the whole area around Foss Islands, the final draining of the King's Fish Pool, the marsh that it had become, the reclamation of the land for industry and for other purposes, and of course initially with Foss Islands Road as well. Then there was also early factory building going on. The glassworks, of course, we've talked about Fishergate. And other factory buildings as well, which were, of course, going to come on very shortly afterwards with the Terry's building in Clementhorpe in the 1860s. The demolition of course, at the start of the 1800s, the demolition of parts of the walls, Barbicans, etc. And also those other developments in terms of the Mechanics Institute I talked about, the schools, the banks and insurance. But one picture I thought I'd put up, which because I love it. It's one of my favorite pictures of industrial York. It's a rather oddball picture from, in fact, that book about that's looking at the Stranger's Guide to York. They somehow seized upon the York Union Gasworks, 1837 to 1850. We're talking close to Heworth Green. The York Gaslight Company was set up in the 1820s, in 1822, in fact, and it was incorporated in 1823. The works were established at Monk Bridge on the River Foss, but a rival undertaking, this one, the York Union Gasworks, was formed and land purchased from the Ecclesiastical Commissioners for Works at Hungate. The two undertakings continued in competition, two gasworks fighting it out until 1844, where they amalgamated to form the York United Gaslight Company. In 1850, the Hungate works were closed and extensions were made to the Monk Bridge site. Obviously, that's further into Layerthorpe. Interesting, isn't it, really? And in a way, that started all sorts of things going on in the Hungate area later on, in terms of Leatham's Mill, in Hungate itself, and again off Foss Islands Road, the likes of the railway goods yard and various sawmills and power stations that would come on by the end of the 19th century. Foss Islands Road exploited the opportunity with the draining of the fish pool and the reclamation of the land to create a huge industrial area that was significant to York for a good 100 or more years on that side of the city. Interesting point that I noticed in the notes, part of the problem, the foulness of the Foss riverbanks remained an enduring problem in the 19th century. Part of the problem was firms using the water. The gas company used 4 million gallons a year of water. So there was therefore poor water flow in the summer, which didn't help in terms of keeping the water supply fresh and acceptable. I'm just going to finish with a little bit on the population of York and one or two other aspects of the city as well. We've got to face facts. It's nice to be celebrate those industrial achievements and commercial and merchanting achievements, but you've still got a population with large numbers of people in poverty all the time, or occasional poverty. Yet you've got a third of the population maybe with servants. This isn't just the gentry or the real wealthy, but even comfortable people had occasional servants. I've given the example on the slide of some of the railway clerks off Holgate Road with the new railway station and all the rest of it. A number had servants. And you've certainly got the growth of middle income earners and opportunities in other commerce. The banks, insurance, I've mentioned those before. And of course, the entrepreneurial spirit, which we talked about before, and it certainly was growing at this stage. But poverty was still significant. Cholera outbreaks and links to poverty. I believe this slide, the slide is of a new replaced sign for the cholera burial ground near the railway station on Station Rise. I've mentioned before the Irish influx into the Hungate area in terms of the chicory business, but also in many other trades as well. By the end of the 1850s, the poor of York were, particularly focused in Wormgate, Fossgate, Peasholm Green, and of course the Water Lanes area as well. Though there were certain improvements in terms of school numbers and other types of social recovery, if you like, in the 1840s and 50s. But it's still worth mentioning that despite all the new employment opportunities with the companies and establishing themselves, there were still a lot of people who were suffering and unable to make use of those opportunities. And to finish with just, of course, the inevitable look at how the city was going to be transformed. You've got the rockets and the railways in the 1840s, which within 2 years, the sort of stagecoach network is blown apart. The last, I think, stagecoach on that particular service, or mail coach from York to London, is 1842. The railways take over very quickly. The poster on the left is an amusing one because obviously it relates to third-class travel. Remember all the time with the railways, they were originally developed for freight. They didn't necessarily see that passenger use would take off so quickly. It was mainly about moving coal and iron around the country. But rapidly, people started to take an interest in railways. I'm looking at Susan Major there, who's an expert in what happened with the parliamentary fairs and other things in the 1840s. But you start to get the use of the railways for passengers at the stagecoach era goes, but you've still got, as I've mentioned before, large numbers of horses around in the city needed to move people from the station to their homes or to the various different factories as well. And the final slide is just to pick up the obvious point in the 19th century. The population of York grows rapidly between 1801 and 1851, but then even more substantially up to 1901, and the railways transform the city. That rather arty photo of mine, I take responsibility for that one, is just some nice historical detail in the 1870s version of the railway station, which of course is where we are today, or where the railways are today. I think that'll do for now from me, but I'm very happy to try and answer a few questions.
One that struck me is that it's just a little flash of inspiration during your piece on chicory. Some months ago, I met up with Rosemary and Nick, and we discussed doing an article about York's lesser known iron foundries. And for one thing, out of every 4 iron founders at this period, 3 went bust. So for every Walker, there was a Bradwell and there was a Keswick and others who disappeared. And also, as partly Rosemary's behest, I went through the census in 1851, 1861, looking at parishes rather than occupations. So I looked through all the parishes in Warmgate and all the parishes around the periphery of Warmgate, assuming every labourer would be an iron founder and assuming that all the Irish would be iron foundry labourers. Not so. I could find no Irish people born in the 1851 or 1861 census who put their occupation as iron founder. Those who did were from Leicestershire and further afield. All the Irish are agricultural labourers, which exactly fits with what Ian said about the migrant labourers going to work for the chicory crop. So that's rather, thanks for that, Ian. That's rather less than solved a question I would have had otherwise. Any other questions, anyone? Yes, hello, Angela.
Perhaps I can follow up the chicory idea again. There seems to be a place called Chicken Yard, just over in Metal. Can you link that with what was going on at Queenston at all? But honestly,
yeah,
there is.
There is a chicory yard, yes. But I must admit, I've been trying to work out whether there are any chicory signs in Dunnington. I was more thinking about it the other way, the other end of the telescope. But yes, I think there must have been some activity with chicory in the heart of York as well. If the crop was being grown at Dunnington and these kilns were in Dunnington, there must have been at some point a process where they were brought back into the city of York and then maybe moved around.
For the benefit of those on Zoom, Angela was asking about the fact that there's many of us know there was a chicory yard on Layerthorpe, and is there a connection? And I can answer a question because the other night I was looking at an article in Yorkshire Archaeological Journal. I think it's in the 1980s, and it's a whole 20-page article on the chicory crop with some useful photos of the chicory works that used to stand at the end of Foss Bank, which some of us remember still standing into the 80s. Chicory Yard is but a stone's throw from there. And in the article, I remember it mentions Chicory Yard, and some of the buildings down there were for the chicory workers. So a reread of that article from the 1980s. It's on the West Yorkshire Library site. You can actually read it online. I'll email you the actual reference for it because I've downloaded some of it, and I'll let you. But there's an article in the 1980s in YAJ, chicory crop. Any more? Do we have any questions? Oh yeah, go on there.
What was chicory used for?
Oh, well, as I say, in part it was a sort of alternative to coffee.
Right.
Horrible, yes. And also there was this theory that there was a medicinal purpose or a medicinal advantage. Here we go. Ground chicory mixed with acorns and breadcrumbs by them was regarded as an instant tonic and cure for insomnia. But I wouldn't take much on that. But apparently that was one of the things. But I suppose it was making it as a drink of some kind, hence grinding it up and using these kilns. But it doesn't seem to have it doesn't seem to have had a very long period when it was at its peak before it sort of faded away again.
Question from Ian.
I remember
Yes.
So chicory just failed to be produced anymore. Camp coffee must be going on.
Yeah. I think we may have an answer at the back. Yes.
If anybody has ever had Viennese coffee, what Viennese coffee was, a certain percentage of chicory. It's still in Oxford, you can get that. We used to sell a Viennese blend, which had about 10% proportion of chicory. Just making coffee go for always a chicory. Oh yeah, it was 90%.
Yeah, you added to coffee.
Just, I'll continue a sec, just yourself. Back.
Coffee and chicory surely that was very prevalent during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And chicory coffee was sold well into the 70s.
Beats wood shavings. The Germans in the First World War ended up with ersatz, which was virtually wood shavings. So a picture seemed to form that once the chicory crop as an individual crop went out of use, it became an additive to other crops as a bulk, a fattener or something to bulk up the product. I'll come to you soon.
So the chicory issue is that it was a lot cheaper than imported coffee.
Yeah.
And there was, you could buy it on its own. You could also buy it in various proportions blended with ground roast coffee. And of course, you were meant to declare that you had mixed it with coffee. One of the biggest issues for Joseph Crabtree's seed was that he was not willing to adulterate his coffee. He stood by the quality of his coffee. He didn't sell chicory as well. He did not make blends. And he accused his rivals of adulterating their coffee and pretending to your coffee when it went through. The production out in Dunnington was of the raw fruit, which was then killed and dried in Dunnington, which made it much easier to transport. And most of the roasting and then grinding was done in the city of York.
That makes sense.
There was also the issue that the imported coffee was subject to duties and taxes, and chicory was not. Joseph Crabtree corresponded with Gladstone, Simon Gladstone was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Eventually, later in the century, after Joseph Crabtree died, there was an adjustment to the tax regime, which meant that chicory was no longer quite as competitive with coffee. And then the final layer in coffee, in a way, was that ground chicory does not keep well. It starts to form lumps, at which point it becomes unusable. And as wealth increased, people could actually afford to buy coffee that not been adulterated.
Yeah, it's just one of those bitter tastes that as a child on choir on Sunday, we'd have coffee. And I know it was coffee because when I went to my grandmother's, I said, "Oh, I've got some coffee in the cupboard. It's called Camp." It'd be like promising a child a piece of chocolate and giving him an aniseed ball. Yes, Susan. Walking. They walked it on each other. There was a question at the back. Sorry, I missed you earlier.
Sorry, the question's been.
No, it's been answered. Yes. As every time I come to all these lectures, all the questions, I can't think of any questions at the end because they've all been answered. Mike. Right.
Wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Any questions on the chat? Oh, sorry, Rosemary, Karen. No, nothing. I think we've. Yeah.
Thank you, absolutely brilliant. I'm more intrigued with what happened before the railways, not being very far from the start railways. And touched on transport between London and York being improved. And I'm wondering if anybody has investigated or has written about how roads themselves were improved. We know about toll roads, and we know about various requirements locally that roads were improved. But roads were very important for bringing goods into and out of York. And you talked about roads within York. Of course, we still see quite early pavements in York. But we have the Irish moving up to Dublin, perhaps with some form of transport to build a particularly there. We know that the basis for the ironworks, the raw materials must have come in. And I'm wondering if anybody has written or investigated very much about the development of roads, improvements of roads, and what effect on York itself and
Yes, Rosemary, for the benefit on Zoom, was asking about, apart from the chicory crop, that with the development of the railways, who was looking after the roads? Certainly on the 1851 Ordnance Survey map, most of the routes leaving York are responsibility of turnpike trusts, various turnpike trusts, especially what's now the A19 northbound. That was the North Allerton Turnpike Trust, and they would take on board of trustees to actually maintain the roads. But yes, the paving of York streets is one of those things that's endlessly in the newspapers in the 1830s and 40s. It's how we know about the date of Hudson Street, stroke Railway Street, stroke George Hudson Street, 1844, because it says recently paved. So you can actually pinpoint these things by the Streets and Buildings Committee minutes. More minutes to look through, Rosemary. This says the Streets and Buildings Committee. But yes, paving of streets with wood. In the 1880s, paving with wood, because it was less bothersome to the horses. So I assume it's going to be macadam on the surface or some sort of waterproofing. Otherwise, it will just rot. So it's a whole chapter of a book on Victorian York about the maintenance of the roads, very relevant today, maintenance of roads and unadopted roads and where we're going with them. And they were probably better then than they are now.
It's quite an interesting point how much York's land use was affected in the 40s and 50s and 30s, so 1830s, 40s and 50s, by all these various road developments that I mentioned before, like Parliament Street and St Leonard's, Duncan Place, Foss Islands, and other changes as well. Queen's Street as well, of course. But most of it was not related to the railways. It all comes a bit before the railways. There's some that are, but not so many. And if you add to it also the substantial land use, as we've talked about Mint Yard, of stabling all over the place, all over York, in the early 19th century, there was a substantial impact of all of these road and other types of and stabling developments actually within the city. It's quite interesting. A lot of it predates the railways. That's what I'm getting at. That in so many other cities, I guess the railways are seen to have a much more profound impact actually in the city centre. But in York, I think our road improvements affected the city centre first, and in many respects more significantly.
Any questions on the chat before I go to Jonathan? No, Jonathan.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
No. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Those on Zoom, Jonathan French has just said, well, the wooden paving in the Paris riots in 1968, students would rip up the wooden block and throw them at the police. But it just seems, anti anything that we do now to actually pave in wood, because wood would just simply absorb water and rot. So, but it was just, there are column inches. So, yeah. Yeah. But touching on Susan's talk a month ago, you can see where the scoria bricks came from. The need to have a stable paving on rather wide back alleys, anything up to 8-10 feet across. So yes, there's a whole article to be written, hopefully on York Historian, about the turnpikes, their influence on York. Pete, that's all for that. Pete, I think that's a Peter Hogarth one lecture. That sorry.
There's a superb map of the turnpikes between York and Hull in the Transport Museum in Hull. It's very, very interesting. It's how thorough the turnpike trust network was on that particular side of the city. We know from other evidence that I think places like Leeds were sometimes incredibly slow about sorting out the turnpikes, and it set Leeds back decades. But certainly on the whole York side, there was an extensive network at one stage, and would have substantially improved communications across that part.
Yeah. Right. Any more questions? Right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a nice full crowd, and there's a good number on Zoom as well tonight. It's a very good subject. So we'll see you in a month's time, when Jonathan will give his talk on preservation tradition in York's churches. Certainly we'll come to that one. All right. So have a safe journey home, everyone. Good night.